speaker that's going to talk to us tonight. He has a wealth of information, a wealth of experience, not only as a candidate for office, but as an expert in election law. And he is going to regale you with all of the good things that can happen and all the things that we need to know. So with no more further ado, Mr. Mark Robert Gordon.
I know you can project.
I can. Hello, Green Valley. Hello. That was pretty good. Let's do it one more time. Hello, Green Valley. Hello. Even better. Good. Nice to see you today. Yes, sir.
You're going to say hello to Santa Rita?
All of it. Santa Rita. But I'm in Green Valley. So, I am Mark Robert Gordon. I'm running for... I don't know that I need this.
Yes, you do.
I do. Okay. I'm a Broadway-trained actor. I can do it. Okay.
It's Green Valley. We have hearings.
I appreciate that. Okay. I am Mark Robert Gordon. I'm a candidate for Secretary of State. This is my home state. I was born and raised in Phoenix. Went to public schools in Phoenix, inner city public schools. As you'll hear, my dad was a disabled World War II veteran. My mother was a public school teacher. I want to tell you a little bit about the Arizona that I came from, what I remember in Arizona, and where we are now, and why it needs to change. I've been working as a federal election protection and voting rights attorney for 26 years. For 24 years, excuse me, and 26 years as a voting rights watchdog around the country. I have a national law office in DC, from which I get called by political parties, by candidates, by not-for-profit organizations, by think tanks, to make sure that voting rights are being protected. Make sure that people's barriers to the rights to vote are being eliminated. Make sure that the Voting Rights Act is being complied with. Make sure that best practices in the industry are being practiced. Make sure that governments are working effectively and proficiently. This is what I do. In 26 years of working in the voting rights field, I have never seen so many voting rights violations committed by an election office in such a short period of time as, and it honestly pains me to say it, in my home state of Arizona.
Wow.
And 26 years experience, I have never seen this. This has got to change. This office, under our current Secretary of State, Michelle Reagan, has committed such violations against voting rights that they're now being looked at by the federal government and being sued. This is how bad it is here. In Maricopa County, my home county, 6-hour lines at the polls. In Cochise County, 5-hour lines at the polls. In Yuma County, 2-hour lines at the polls. This is the chief elections office in the state. And even though in Arizona, the elections are run by the counties, this is where the buck stops. And you have to take responsibility. Or our current secretary doesn't think so, but you do. And she's going to find that out in November. Perhaps in August in her own primary. This is where we're at in Arizona. 6-hour lines, 5-hour lines, 2-hour lines. 200,000 of your fellow citizens did not receive election pamphlets as statutorily required to give them information about where to go to vote, when to vote, what is on the ballot, with 2 hotly contested propositions. 200,000 people. 30,000 of your fellow citizens were purged from voter rolls because their names sounded similar to names from out of state under a system that was clearly made to purge voters. It wasn't to prevent anything legitimate. There was no proof that the people were actually the same person, just the names sounded similar. 30,000 people. The wrong date for an election published on the Secretary of State's own website twice. Kept up for days after being notified of the wrong date. The wrong number of signatures required to get on the ballot, published on the Secretary of State's website. So how are candidates supposed to know what to do? This is what we're facing in the Secretary of State's office. Beyond everything else, beyond all the other inefficiencies that you've heard, these are serious voting rights violations. She is up for re-election. It's basically a performance review. A lot of you have probably been in business. I've been in business. I've hired and fired people. I've been on the other end of both of those. I'm not fired, but I mean I've had performance reviews. An election is a performance review. This is not a performance worth a repeat. She needs to go. But beyond just needing to go, it's who do you replace her with? We are in very dangerous times right now. We're at a time where our most fundamental right, this right to vote, is under challenge and under attack by people and groups and legislators and a governor and a Secretary of State that are coming up with new and creative ways to challenge and put up barriers for people's right to vote. Where at the same time, we have a hostile foreign government that has committed an act of war through our election system itself. So, when we filed for office, the Republic asked me a question, and I responded, well, when you have a plumbing problem, you call a plumber. We have an election problem here, and a very serious one. I happen to be a 26-year veteran of this fight. I happen to be somebody that governments, parties, candidates, not-for-profits, think tanks have called to solve this problem. We have, it's not a plumbing problem, we have an election problem. Call in an election specialist. That's why I stepped up to run for this office. After working in the background for a number of years, the time was right for me to step forward because the stakes are too high. They're too fundamental. They're too serious to simply be a matter of political opportunity. And that's what this office, unfortunately, has become over the years. This office now is thought of as a stepping stone to governor, and it shouldn't be. I know it was mentioned, and that's true. 5 of the last 9 secretaries of state have acceded up to governor because of death, or in this state, resignation or impeachment. But that's not why somebody should take this job. You should want to go into a job of public trust to be the best person at that job, to really want to do that job. And right now, the stakes for our elections, for the security of our elections, to make sure that rights are protected, it's too precious a right to be politicized. That office needs to be reprofessionalized. That office needs to be made back to what it was when I grew up. A nonpartisan, fair, even-handed office that served all of Arizona. This is why I'm running. So, in the Arizona I grew up, we had a Secretary of State named Rose Mofford. Yeah, listen to that. I love doing that. I can talk to Republican groups and I'll get the same response for those who've been in Arizona long enough. Everybody loved Rose Mofford, whether you were a Democrat or a Republican, it didn't matter. For the most part, wouldn't even know her political affiliation when she was Secretary of State. She was there to do a job, to serve all of Arizona, effectively, fairly, in a nonpartisan manner. She was, as she described herself, the lady down the hallway with the crazy hairdo. That was our Rose. She was there to celebrate Arizona, and that's what the Secretary of State should be. It should be the one unifying, non-politically run office. It's there to make sure that the election system works fairly and in a nonpartisan fashion for everybody. It's there to make sure the other functions of that office are fairly serving the entire state. Secretary of State is also your chief librarian, your chief archivist. It's basically your chief promoter and historian for the state, making sure that the diversity, is that for me? Oh, thank you so much. Just when I needed it, thank you. To make sure that the state is being run in all ways, treasuring its people and the diversity and the cultures and the backgrounds of this beautiful state. That's what this office should be about. It shouldn't be a divisive office like it is now. And the war between the Secretary of State and the legislature, the war between the Secretary of State and, for goodness sake, the 15 county recorders who run the elections is ridiculous. It's absurd. It's self-serving. It's political. It's being used as an opportunity for her to advance for governor. And I gotta say this, I've been involved in politics in the background for 33 years, since I was a kid here. Yeah, I know, well, no, all of it. All of it. I like that. It's a little bit higher than I would have gone, but that's all right. For 33 years, you know, I have never seen here or anywhere else in the country somebody running for one office, spending paid airtime talking about the next office.
Wow.
Until Michelle Reagan ran against Terry Goddard in the final weeks of that race in 2014. She spent half of those commercial, half of the time in those commercials talking about the next office, governor. Again, you don't run for Secretary of State because it's the next office or just to become governor. You should want to be the best Secretary of State that there's been. You should want to make sure that you're there to protect the public, not to protect your political career. That's what that office is supposed to be there for. So, in the Arizona that I grew up in, anybody can help you vote. Arizona was a place that cherished people's voting rights. They wanted participation. From our founding, the Citizens Initiative was something that made Arizona special. You know, the same year that Arizona became a state, 1912, there was a Citizens Initiative, successful, to give women the right to vote. That was years in advance of the 19th Amendment. This is ingrained in the fabric of our state, of our heritage. We believe in the rights of citizens, of the public. So, we get to, you know, when I was a kid, it's a little bit later than 1912. In the 1980s, I mentioned before, my dad was a disabled World War II veteran. And he also contracted a very serious illness. And in the 80s, he couldn't make it out of the house for days or weeks or a month at a time. And this was someone who, you know, he was a lone survivor of 3 airplane crashes in World War II. He had liberated Dachau. He had been at Normandy. He had been in North Africa. This is someone for whom citizenship meant everything. We used to raise the flag together outside the house every morning when he was able. And he became too infirm to do that anymore by the time I was in high school. So in the Arizona I remember, if you couldn't make it out of the house to vote, you could have anybody come and help you vote. Right, they came to you. That's precisely right. It was about increasing participation. It was about making the system work for everybody. We cherish the right to vote. We cherish the process. Can't think where we are now. It's a felony, right? So in the Arizona that I remember, we didn't have the PEVL, the permanent early voting list, like the ballot that you get in the yellow envelope that you mail back. That wasn't around, the permanent list. It was before absentee voting was that common. But if you needed to vote and you needed help, you could call anybody to your house so long as you had a notarized slip of paper to accompany that ballot to go in to say, yeah, I'm the person who cast this ballot. That's the Arizona that it should be. And today, in a law championed by our current chief elections official, the Secretary of State, it is now a felony to help somebody vote in such a way unless you're a household member, unless you're an election official, or unless you're a home attendant. Anybody else is committing a felony. So the people that used to help my dad vote, we used to call notaries, we used to call neighbors, we used to call the Democratic Party, we used to call bankers to help my dad vote. They all committed felonies in today's Arizona. And the champion of that bill that became a law is your current chief elections official, Michelle Reagan. And talk about politicizing this office that's supposed to be run in a nonpartisan and fair fashion. Michelle Reagan, shortly after getting in office as Secretary of State, she spoke before CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee.
Oh dear.
Oh dear is right. You know, we're all entitled to political philosophies. But when it comes to voting, no. She got before there, and before that group, and in a speech that I assure you was not written by her, she got up there and said that she kept 1,500 votes with this bill and law from being illegally cast by one person. Right? What is right? It's just the opposite. This law prevented 1,500 legitimate votes from being cast. People that couldn't leave a nursing home, people that couldn't leave their house, or people that, you know, just have 4 jobs or whatever going on and need some help to take their ballot to the mailbox. And, you know, this is the Arizona that we're at right now. This office has been politicized. We need to take it back. I myself, having worked in voting rights for a number of years, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I myself, having worked in voting rights for a number of years, had a very bad accident. That's why I'm doing the shuffle here with my feet. Had an accident, and I couldn't make it out of my New York City apartment to go down 4 flights of steps 2 blocks away to mail my absentee ballot to Arizona to get back to Maricopa County. I had to have somebody come and help me after working in voting rights for a number of years. Just take my ballot to the mailbox. In today's Arizona, that person committed a felony. It's absurd. The only crime here is preventing people from voting. Legitimate citizens from voting. This needs to stop. So, this is why I am passionate about it. It comes from my dad. It comes from my own experience. It's why I chose this particular field to be working in for 20 some odd years. So I went out of public schools, inner city public schools in Phoenix. I went on to Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Got a certificate from Afro-American Studies from Princeton. By the time I graduated from Princeton, I had finished my first 2 years at Columbia Law School. I later went on to Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and got a master's of public administration. While I was at Columbia, I saw a sign on a bulletin board, because I had time on my hands, doing 2 degrees at once, and an acting career, and I'll get to that a little bit later. I saw a sign on the bulletin board from the League of Women Voters that they needed help with election protection. I didn't know precisely what that was, but based on my dad's experience, I wanted to get involved. It was basically making sure, because there were some voting rights issues in New York City, making sure that people's, particularly immigrants' voting rights were protected. So I started volunteering for them. I volunteered for Gay Men's Health Crisis, had the same thing. Some other organizations had the same type of programs. I began volunteering as different elections happened and as we were in a presidential primary year. After law school, I took a job with the Hispanic Federation of New York City, which was an umbrella organization serving multiple social service organizations serving the Spanish-speaking population of the 5 boroughs of New York. And I got placed under a Department of Health AIDS Institute contract to do outreach to the community. Not that I speak Spanish, or at least not well enough for people other than me to understand what I'm trying to say. But to do outreach on HIV and AIDS prevention and services to a community that was afraid to talk about the subject, to a community that was afraid to interact with government agencies in a time that was much in the early 90s like today. Fear that family members might get trapped by the INS somehow. Fear of interacting with the system. So, as part of that job that I took the opportunity to set up my first election protection program where I set it up, serving that same population. It's a program that, as I understand, still exists today. From there, I went on and established my national law office in DC. And as I said, I get called by governments, by political parties, by candidates, by not-for-profits, by think tanks, to set up election protection programs, to monitor the vote, to make sure that it's working correctly, make sure best practices are followed, etc. For example, in the past year alone, the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, and the Georgia Democratic Party called my law office and me so that I could go to Georgia for that congressional runoff, the John Ossoff race in June, a very expensive race for that seat. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story what happened there in a minute. So that was in June. In November, the Virginia Democratic Party called me as part of their legal team to go down to Virginia for the general election in November. Alabama, not-for-profits there, consulted with me for their U.S. Senate special election in December. For the last about 5 years, I've been the Maricopa County Democratic Party's election integrity director, the one who's credentialing the poll observers, getting the lawyers ready in case something needs to go to court, briefing, preparing the manual, etc. Adrian Fontes, the new, and I love saying the word new, the new county recorder in Maricopa County, had a bipartisan transition team when he came into office. First time someone had been there in over 2 decades, someone new. He had a bipartisan stellar team of former and current elected officials on both sides. He had Terry Goddard and Felicia Rodolini and others on the Democratic side. He had Rick Romley, Andy Kanasik, and others on the Republican side. He had a libertarian, Judge Buttrick, on the commission, on this team. But he needed somebody to teach best practices in the industry, to bring the office up to speed in terms of the challenges to voting rights in the industry, to make sure that in that, which is the 4th most populous county in the country, that what happened in 2016 and in 2014 and in 2012 and in 2010 and 2008 didn't happen again. He wanted somebody that has dealt with voting rights. So he brought me in as his election specialist. All of this background is to say, this is who I am, this is what I do. I protect people's right to vote. I've been called by governments, I've been called by business leaders, I've been called by elected officials, and by candidates to make sure that your rights are protected. And the Office of Secretary of State, particularly now, already? Particularly now, when we have such challenges to voting rights, when Arizona is taking a race to the bottom in terms of protecting people's rights, when there is a hostile foreign government that's attacked our system, particularly now, we feel that you need, and that the state would benefit from, someone with election experience in this role as Secretary of State. That's why I'm running. So, I was told to give a little history on voting rights. That's the campaign end of this. I will be happy to give a little bit, and it ties back to that Georgia story and to Arizona in it. There was a U.S. Supreme Court decision in 2013 called Shelby County v. Holder, a 5-4 decision. Shelby County is in Alabama, in an urban part of Alabama. And the county said, you know what? We have cleaned up our act. There's no more discrimination here in terms of how we're running our elections, whether intentional or the impact of our elections. And therefore, we don't need to have to go to the federal government and the Justice Department or the courts every time to approve or pre-approve our election plans or anything that might touch elections. So they sued to get removed from the Voting Rights Act. To get removed from having pre-clearance, which means you have to go to the federal government or a court to have everything pre-approved before it goes into place. Now, the Voting Rights Act primarily affected, there are some scattered counties, including in New York City, including some in California, including in the Midwest, but it's mostly 9 states that were subject to the Voting Rights Act pre-clearance. 7 states in the Deep South, the former Confederacy. Alaska was later added a few years after the Voting Rights Act. Right? Voting Rights Act was 65, a few years later. Anyone want to guess which was state number 9? Aren't you so proud? Aren't you so proud? So, this discrimination and this problem with voting in Arizona goes back a long way.
Yes.
A long way. They used to go through, and someone who became Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, William Rehnquist, in Arizona was one of the leaders of this program, going poll by poll by poll in South and Western Phoenix. If you had a Hispanic name, they challenged your right to vote. If you had a skin color that was darker than mine, they challenged your right to vote. This is why Arizona got placed, because of its egregious history in voting rights. And its demonstrable and repeat pattern. It's a serious problem. It's gone on decades here. So this county in Alabama, Shelby County, sued to be removed from federal oversight, saying that they cleaned up their act in 2010, I believe it was. And it went to the first court, and the court laughed them out of the room. Said no. They went on and appealed. Same thing. It was a panel of judges. They said the same thing. No. But the Supreme Court, for some reason, took this case. And it was a 5-4 decision, written by Justice Roberts. 5-4.
Support there.
Well, to reverse the lower court rulings. The lower courts had ruled
Right.
that, no, you need to still have federal oversight. And then it went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court looked at this, and under Chief Justice Roberts and the court, the 5-4 majority, said, well, it's now 2013, and we don't know that the circumstances with the data that's in front of us, which is what Shelby County had from the 80s, and the Justice Department, had regarding Shelby County from the 80s. We don't know that this data showing some discrimination still exists in 2013. So therefore, we're holding it unconstitutional to hold you responsible under paragraph 4B and 5 of the Voting Rights Act based upon old data. If I'm boiling down their opinion here. So that applied to all the jurisdictions that had old data. Well, guess who had old data?
Oh my God.
Guess who locally had old data? So we no longer had to go to the federal Justice Department to get a pre-approval of our elections. Any of those other jurisdictions didn't either. They all had to start from scratch. So here's what happened in our beautiful state. The legislature, in its wisdom, decided, look, we've been talking about, we tax and spend too much. We're going to show the counties that they can get by with less. So that they gave less money to the counties. That's decision number 1, that formally, in the old days, 2012, would have required pre-clearance by the Justice Department because it might impact elections. Step 2, it went to the counties. In my county, Maricopa County, the 4th most populous county in the country. Keep that in mind. I think it's the 10th largest landmass county. It's either 10th or 14th. I think it's 10th. Largest landmass county in the country. In Maricopa County, went to the Board of Supervisors. The Board of Supervisors said, well, we have less money coming from the state, and elections only happen a few times, during the cycle, so we're going to cut back the amount that we're spending on elections for everything else that we have to do. That's step number 2, that formally, in the old days, 2012, would have required federal pre-clearance, but now no longer did because of Shelby County v. Holder's 5-4 decision. Step 3 went to our now, and I love saying this word, former county recorder, Michelle Reagan, she'll be former soon enough, to Helen Purcell. Helen Purcell said, well, we have less money now from the county to spend on elections. So, we have 205 polling sites for the presidential preference election, the last presidential preference election, 2012. We're going to reduce 205 sites in the 4th most populous county, and I believe it's the 10th largest landmass county, 205 sites to 60. But we're going to make it easier, and this part actually did sound good. We're going to make it easier by setting up voting centers where you can go to any one of those polls. You're no longer restricted to your precinct. That sounds good. If it's convenient to get to one of those locations. But if you ride public transit and it's miles apart between your sites, and buses only run certain times, and it's close, miles less in North Scottsdale where people have nice cars to take them places. That's a problem. But that was step 3, Helen Purcell's decision, that would have formerly, in the old days of 2012, required federal preclearance. This is what happened. It's a direct link to Shelby County v. Holder. What happened in Arizona that gave Arizona yet another black eye nationally was a direct result of that federal decision. Now, did our Secretary of State, your chief elections official, speak up against this? No. In fact, she said that this will make it for an easier voter experience. Being able to go to any poll, and that could. Well, 6-hour lines later in Maricopa County, caught like a deer in the headlights of her own policy failure, her office blamed voter confusion for the problem. This is the office and the office holder that's supposed to be there to protect you. The governor didn't complain about the poll reductions ahead of time. The Secretary of State didn't complain about the poll closings ahead of time. The county supervisors didn't complain about it. The county recorder didn't complain about it. The legislative leadership didn't complain about it. Maricopa County Democratic Party Election Integrity Committee complained about it ahead of time. And I say that because we're in, again, coming back to campaign mode, we're in such dire times with voting rights, such precious times, that you have to have foresight for what policy implications are going to be. You have to be able to predict what the problems are going to be and have an effective voice to fight for you ahead of time. We can't keep waiting for after the fact. 200,000 election pamphlets not mailed out. And by the way, a Secretary of State that her office knew about it ahead of time and could have done something about it, and the Republican Attorney General has taken her to task and said that they broke the law. It was a crime committed by the Secretary of State's office to go ahead with that election and not issue those 200,000 election pamphlets I spoke about earlier. The problem is the law had no consequences built into it. There was no penalty. No jail time for anybody. Nobody's even been fired from her office for any of these mistakes, by the way. Not a single one. So this is what we're dealing with. So a little bit more on Shelby County v. Holder. I mentioned I was in Georgia doing as part of their election protection team for the June congressional runoff. When I got to Georgia, in DeKalb County, a heavy middle-class African-American county, in every single poll site that I went to on election day, there was an armed officer of the law standing in the doorway of every polling site in DeKalb County. The only county I saw or heard of that in. There was an armed officer of the law standing inside the polls where you go to pick up your electronic voting card and where you go to turn in your voting card. Why? This is the South. It's a changing South. It's the new South, but it's still the South. And a little bit before my time, there were people standing in the doorway when people went to go to vote. There were people standing in the doorway when people went to public schools. There were people in the doorway of buses when people went to use public transportation. That was Shelby County v. Holder, new law. So Georgia was also one of those states that was under federal preclearance guidelines, and now they were left to their own devices. This is what happens. Well, I got on the ground, and I spoke about the Constitution and law, history, facts.
Yeah.
Funny thing, facts, right?
Yeah.
I threatened a lawsuit. I got them to stand down. They went back to their cars, those that were standing in the doorways, and watched from there. I couldn't get them to leave the poll sites themselves because it was a law. And they were ordered there by the sheriff, an African-American sheriff at that. And most of those officers were African-American, which may surprise you. Doesn't matter, it's a culture. It's a culture of a history there. And it's a mistake in terms of voting rights, and it's intimidation, which I heard several of you say. Just looks like it. But I got the ones inside to step back, to step back and to disarm. Why do they need arms? I mean, what was going to happen there? You know, so this is what we're dealing with, you know, and when I'm talking about new and creative ways, well, they're coming up with all types of things now. It's just amazing. So, again, this is the history lesson. This is what I do. This is who I am. This is why I'm running. The stakes are too high right now. And this office has to be treated for what it is. It is the chief protection office for your right to vote and for everyone's right to vote. And you need a Secretary of State who can have the foresight for problems of things that will come out of this legislature because it hasn't been stopped from coming from the legislature. Someone who's dealt with this from experience, to be able to effectively and vocally speak on behalf of you and your rights. I'm not a wallflower.
Really?
I'm aiming for this challenge because I've been doing this for so long, and there's a reason why governments and candidates and not-for-profits and think tanks have called upon me. This is what I do. This is what I do. So I am thrilled to be here today. I appreciate the invitation. I was told this was going to be a warm group. We need help getting on the ballot. The petitions are due the end of next month. We need a whole lot of petitions. They're coming at me on both sides right now, Republican and Democratic challengers. That should tell you something. I need help. If you have not already signed a petition for Secretary of State, please sign my petition so that I can get on the ballot.
Did you bring one today?
We brought several today. The petitions, they're circulating right now up and down the table.
Okay.
Up and down the tables here. If you could sign, you're getting the brochures and the little gift basket that goes with it. It's actually a gift basket for us. It's not a gift, it's on tape. It's not a gift. I understand campaign finance laws. It's not a gift. We need money. This is going to be a very expensive race. I would have loved to have run under the Clean Elections Program. This is the office that regulates campaign finance, it regulates lobbyists. The truth is, this office cannot be won right now by somebody of our party under the Clean Election System. Terry Goddard tried. I actually went to him ahead of time and I said, Terry, I don't have your name recognition. I don't have your family history here. I said, I would love to run clean, but he said, you have a Rolodex, and I understand they took away the matching funds from the Clean Election System now, so I wouldn't blame you for running traditional. So with that, I'm asking for your support. This is going to be a 7-figure race for Secretary of State of Arizona.
Wow.
So that's where we're at. This is one of the most flippable Secretary of State races in the country, so it's considered a toss-up. Primarily, frankly, if I'm the nominee. With due respect to my competitors. There's 3 Democrats running, and I don't know the current count because some people on the Republican Party side dropped out from the Secretary of State's race. We have to get an accurate count, but there's multiple candidates on the Republican side, including Michelle Reagan running for re-election because she thinks she's earned it. So it's going to be a big race. It's going to be a big race. We need your help. We need your word of mouth as much as anything else. So thank you for having me here today. I'm happy to take a few questions, and thank you for your time.